With God Valley finally concluding, several new pieces of information have emerged, including more info on how emus deal with the devil works, Shanks' master plan, the Florian Triangle, and several small details such as hidden cameos, references, and much more. So let's break down these past couple incredibly dense chapters together. In case you missed it, on the Shonen Jump cover we get the official color scheme of Jebek, which shows him as having white hair with hues of a purple dark blue mix, with his tattoo instead being a deeper purple and his cape being black. His eyes are also red, which is the exact identical color as Blackbeard canonically has, which makes sense as he has inherited his eyes. On the color spread itself, we have the Straw Hats enjoying roasted potatoes alongside Yamato, Tama, and Shinobu, as well as some fellow ninja tanuki and foxes. On their outfits are several writings, such as Nami's jacket having the writing Any Port, Zoro's hat having Cast Off, but more importantly is Yamato's sweater, which has Oden ni Soro written on it, which is part, of course, of Oden's iconic line Niete nambo no Oden ni Soro, or there's no point to Oden if it isn't served boiled. Fittingly, unlike Luffy or Zoro, Yamato has no issues eating the hot potatoes. Interestingly though, Nami appears to have clearer, more blue eyes, despite canonically having brown eyes, but Oda has been slightly inconsistent with eye colors in the past anyway, so let's not obsess over it. Jebek regains some consciousness, realizing that the effect of Domi Reversi has worn off. I do wonder in that regard if all this time that Jebek was suffering from the effects of the Reversi and was still able to communicate to Garp and Roger, if it had simply to do with the voice of all things, or if in fact it may perhaps tie with the speculated Buccaneer heritage. Particularly because, as Vegapunk explained if you remember, the power of the Buccaneers is seemingly tied with allowing your will to remain in your body even after you lose your consciousness or your life, in the way that Kuma was completely killed and yet his will still persisted in his body. So perhaps even if the Domi Reversi took over and overwrote Jebek's will, it was still Jebek's lingering will that made him go towards Roger and Garp even without Imu's explicit request, because even Imu was surprised that Jebek just suddenly showed up in front of Roger and Garp after being called, and it could be why we could still see him expressing emotion while possessed, and why he was able to communicate via the voice of all things, unlike giants like Dory and Bragi who, despite still being mighty warriors in their own right, were able to do absolutely nothing in the face of Domi Reversi. However, while Jebek still lived and Roger and Garp were passed out, Garling, Summers, and Maffy arrived to finish him off, as he gives one last thanks to his two rivals. We, however, quickly cut ahead to Gaban and Rayleigh running away with Garp and Roger. This may seem confusing, but given their dialogue, it would seem that they arrived just as Jebek was being killed, as there wouldn't be much reason to not save Jebek if they're already willing to protect an enemy like Garp. And as Rayleigh said, he was killed, speaking in past tense in Japanese, meaning that once they arrived, they probably already witnessed Garling killing Jebek. But it's likely the God Knights moved to kill the other two, and that's when they stepped in, helping them get away. It's a shame it had to be off-screened, but I imagine this is where Gaban likely fought with Summers, and left him with the trauma that you would later remember in Elbaf. But after a brief clash, they took the two injured and run away, with Rayleigh in particular also making sure to keep the straw hat that his captain threw away if you look closely, while the cape instead, of course, remained behind. The island instead began to collapse on itself from the damage, seemingly not from any attack like Lelouch, but simply from the sustained damage after such an intense fight, which explains that in fact God Valley did literally disappear from the map beyond the censoring of the government mentioned last week, just as Sengoku told us. So in fact, the island was both erased from history and also literally vanished after being destroyed. As we finally depart from the island though, we get a nice summary of what happened. Garp seemingly was left with the Marines and began to recover. Roger recovered on his own ship. Whitebeard left with Graham, Linlin left with her own treasures and Stroysen, Kaido left flying, Dragon saved several remaining slaves, Shanks remained asleep in Roger's coffers, and Kuma made it out safely with Ivankov, Genie, Eris, and Teach. We know that some of the other Rocks pirates like Shiki did make it out, with him in particular probably just flying off, but the fates of the likes of Ganzui and whatnot are a bit ambiguous, unclear if they did die here on the island, or they all made it out and simply died at different points, and only much later would Moria collect their corpses. As we focus on Roger particularly though, we see him having recovered, coming out on the ship's deck. Behind him are Gloriosa, who likely helped out, and Mr. Momota. This seems to imply that Mr. Momota acted as the ship's doctor, which makes sense since this was long before Crocus joined the crew, so during that time Momota may have acted as the doctor until Crocus stepped in to better fulfill that position, since it was said that he could stabilize Roger's condition since he was one of the best doctors in the world. However, of course, Roger runs upon the treasure chest containing a baby Shanks inside, which would lead down the road to adopting him as his own child. This, of course, isn't anything new, as we first saw this scene during a brief flashback in film Red, and in fact we had also seen it in more detail in the film Red booklet that was given to us who went to watch it in cinemas, at least in the countries where the booklet was distributed, where Oda himself had fully storyboarded 2 pages of this encounter. The second page here is made to look identical to his sketches in the storyboard, but the first one differs a bit, as the original didn't show things like Shaki, or alternatively actually showed God Valley in the background still intact, so that had to be changed, which in the sketch was still standing. But that left page is actually a lot more similar to that sketch, even though Roger, of course, here doesn't have his later hat and mustache as that storyboard accidentally had. A famous fanart recreation of this sketch had become very popular online, but some fans even mistook it for actually being drawn by Oda, so it's nice to get the actual official version based on that original storyboard. As to be expected, the news spread across the world fast. We see a few different islands where those news reach. First, there's one that has several eastern-looking pagodas. Another one features a house with a triangular roof, and a man with a fedora and a woman with a dress. The next is in a tropical setting with palm trees and tropical outfits, likely to be the South Blue given its general tropical climate. While the following one instead has a frigid climate, which could be a winter island, but given the contrast, I think it makes more sense to be a frigid island of the North Blue, featuring Nordic wooden houses well suited for the snow, with a large bridge in the middle with a clock tower atop it. The locals praise Garp for his strength, clearly some fellow power scalers. We shift to Marine headquarters, where Garp is furious upon reading the news as he recovers within the medical ward, as of course Morgans has made quite the profit from the entire dilemma, and he has a debate with Sengoku over their powerlessness to do anything against the corruption of the government, with Garp sticking to his beliefs of wishing to do what he can to protect others while he is in the Marines. Sengoku says that there's nothing they can do from the bottom of the cliff, Gake no shita, which is an expression that is fitting both symbolically but even quite literally, as Marineford is located right beneath Marijois under the cliff that is the Red Line. He also puts into perspective the size of the government's power, stating that with the combined power of all the Marines and all the armies of all 170 or so nations, you could account for tens of millions of soldiers across the globe. For reference, the biggest army in our world, China's, is comprised by 2 million soldiers, so that gives you an idea of the stranglehold that the government has, with a bigger combined military than most of our world's biggest powers combined. However, that is, of course, assuming that those countries do remain loyal in the case of an upheaval of the system as the world changes. And for better perspective, the core bulk of the Marines' strongest forces, which took part in the Battle of Marineford, was said to be 100,000 soldiers. But during this whole debate, if you look behind Garp, you can actually spot Dr. Fishbonin, a doctor in Marineford's medical ward who would later tend to Kobe's wounds after the Battle of Marineford 4 decades later in chapter 594, showing that he's had quite a long career here. Shifting to a later scene in Marineford, we move to the Tainment Center of Marineford found underground, seemingly found under the tower on the island's southwestern side, or to the right side of the fortress as seen in the front, with that small red tower. If you look at a panoramic look of the fortress, you'll spot the tower on the bottom right, whereas an identical tower on the bottom left instead houses the medical center, as indicated by the med writing on it as seen previously. The detention one instead has a DIC written on it, so I wonder if it relates to an acronym, something having to do with detention or something like that. Within it, Dragon has been jailed for helping save the slaves, so he's paid a visit by Garp. There's clearly tension between father and son, as Dragon dragon calls him Oyaji, which means old man. It's a already fairly disrespectful way to address your father, but then changes it to Anta or you when he tells him that he hates him, basically being unwilling to even call him his own father anymore. Garp seems unwilling to look him back in the eyes, but leaves a key behind, implying he let Dragon escape, which would lead him to form the Freedom Fighters. But clearly, with Dragon unwilling to recognize Garp as his father anymore, this relationship would struggle to be repaired. We had a similar scene when Garp visited Ace in Impel Down, but of course in that context it was very different, as Impel Down was far harder to break out of, and Ace was such a major criminal at the center of a massive war, rather than Marine punished for insubordination. But even with Ace, we saw how Garp wavered in the face of family. We see Loki's reaction to Jebek's death, which gives us a better insight as to why Rox didn't let him on his ship, which was very much the same line of logic that Shanks had, to not let a kid go out at sea. As the two talk, you can see chatter coming from Ida's bar behind them, showing that the crew is likely relaxing there, while Jebek is having a moment with Loki. Loki, however, mentions that in his eyes, he views Jebek as Nika, since he perceives Nika as someone who will destroy the world while laughing, which of course he interpreted from Nika's continuous apparitions during the end of each world as mentioned in the Harley, just like how Yarul explained it to us. But Jebek clarifies he only wants to become king of the world, to fulfill Davy Jones's promise, whereas the one with the power to destroy the world could actually be Harald, particularly bringing up the Galela once again, proving it wasn't just out of trying to tie things loosely, but that the Galela may actually hold some important significance in the future. As a reminder, many of us think that the Galela, this famous band of very powerful giants that disappeared and was supposedly frozen long ago, may be the giants frozen in Punk Hazard, and Jebek believes that they are such a powerful asset that they could heavily tip the power of Warland's military force, that when combined with Jebek, they would truly be unstoppable. So I wonder if perhaps Oda is hinting at the Straw Hats or one of their allies somehow being able to find the Galela in Punk Hazard to unfreeze them so they can join in on the final war. Or perhaps, maybe, if Blackbeard will be the one to find them and recruit them to his side, just as Jebek intended to. We shift to another island with a gigantic spire similar to those of the buildings on it, but appearing more to be made of stone or wood of some form. Here Harald loses control against a giant for transgressing against the humans, but in doing so ends up terrifying the local civilians as well, as he's clearly overcome with grief and rage for abandoning Jebek, whom he even calls his best friend. This is followed by a scene where Harald goes to Marineford, but before that he speaks with Loki and Hyrudin, asking them to get along. You may actually recall we already saw this scene previously in a prior flashback, and in that scene back then, Harald still had his horns, which is consistent. Indeed, we see Harald go all the way to Marineford and ripping his own horns off in front of the Marines, in order to apologize for the past millennium of giant violence so that humans and giant kind can coexist together. This lines up with what Road told us, that Harald ripped off his horns in order to disown the heritage of the violent ancient giants who had terrorized the world during the time of the Era of War, as well as for the actions of Ors the Country Puller. But at this point it seems that Harald decides to not hesitate anymore and devote himself fully to allowing for that peace to coexist, even if that means him becoming a slave and having to submit to the government. In the end, this is a difficult choice for Harald, and I think it's very important to acknowledge it that it may not be necessarily the right choice either. To me, it feels that at this point Harald regrets not having helped Jebek, that he understands that he already lost that opportunity to stand by his side and change history, so instead now he has to commit to the choices he's made. Think of it like an alia jacta est, the dice is already thrown. Harald realizes this is the path he has chosen for himself, and he decides to properly commit to it no matter the issues that there may be with it. It may not exactly be the right choice, but he's not exactly in the right mental state either, and he's trying to do what he believes is the right thing, even if it may lead down to more problems down the line. Don't get me wrong, Harald understands well the corruption of the government, but like other rulers, he believes it may be better for his race to work with the status quo so that future generations of giants can live in peace with humans rather than pointlessly try to fight against the government and let Elbaf and its people end up being destroyed at the hands of it. Particularly now that Jebek is gone, and Harald may feel that there may may be no other force in this world that can topple the government anymore, and feeling responsible for it, that he feels he can only now commit to this choice. It may not be the right choice, but it's the choice a ruler would make for the interest of his country, even if it means groveling to a much higher power, much like how real rulers of our world may act and grovel to a higher power just for the sake of attaining a favor for their people, or well, themselves in some cases. Whether you agree with that action or not, it's down to you, but in the end, this is politics. As after all, Harald is still playing into Imu's hands, even if Imu did blame Harald's mistake for being the reason as to why Elbaf did not fall under their thumb much earlier. So, did something else happen, or is Imu referring to mistakes past? It seems at least that now, little by little, we're finally getting back to the point where we'll finally understand what happened in the castle that day. The next chapter picks up 5 years after the incident 33 years ago, where Morgans, now aged 20, is interviewing witnesses about the claim of seeing mysterious figure at sea. The person talking has a shirt with a writing where the first character is a bit hard to read, but seems like it could spell out Atodayo, which means something like and then, like he's trying to continue the story, but hard to say with how weird the first character looks. On the left of the panel, there's a guy with the writing Hora Fukime written on the side of his head, which means something like, come on man, make up your mind. And Morgans himself, you may notice a pair of headphones with the writing TD on them, or tone dial, which if you remember from Gunko's headphones, are essentially modified tone dials from Sky Islands that record a specific song. Behind him instead you can spot another panda man doing the peace sign. The location they are at has a big clock tower, which resembles that of the Rommel Kingdom, inspired by the Big Ben, which was the kingdom where Cavendish became a criminal due to Hakuba, but hard to say if they are the same due to some minor differences. Having pulled down, a bunch of prisoners complain about these phantom attacks, as seemingly they were captured right after the attack, which makes sense if it was Harald. In the next scene, an interviewer asks a fisherman about it, who has the writing Mek Mek on his shirt, though I'm not as certain about what it actually means here. The one interviewing him is actually someone we already know though, as his hat has the writing Reuder. Reuder is in fact a reporter who was present at Shabondi covering with the Marine for war. You might remember him reacting to the reveal Ace was Roger's son, and he was named in the Blue Deep databook, though given the lack of romanization, places like the wiki had him written as Reuder, pronounced also the same way, Reuder. Behind him on the right you can also spot a woman flirting with another sailor, as indicated by the hearts. Reuter asks if this phantom figure was seen in the Florian Triangle, which may I remind, the kanji reads as Devil's Triangle, but the sailor claims that they do not go near that region, essentially implying that this shadow they saw was in fact not the same of the Florian Triangle. So it is trying to tell us that the mysterious entity which we saw in the Florian Triangle at the end of Thriller Bark is in fact not these mysterious attacks, which instead prove to be Harald working for the government, but rather its own completely different thing, which Oda is telling us is something else entirely, and at this point something he's more likely to go back to. As we skip a bit ahead, we see the growth of the defining pirates of God Valley across the several years. Kaido now sports a beard and mustache, much more similar to his current look. Whitebeard has already formed his own crew and can be seen casting haki lightning bolts from his Muraku no Giri. Big Mom continues to age as she looks almost as if she was giving Whitebeard a side glance, with Napoleon above her doing the same. Behind her, the sky is clouded, perhaps an effect of her weather abilities with Zeus. Ochoku has now gained territory over Pirate Island, though interestingly he has a scar on his face, so I wonder if someone tried to contest him for the position and that's how he got that scar, while Shiki instead started to grow out his beard. The description of clashes over territory between them makes me wonder if Shiki attempted to retake Hachinosu, but it didn't amount to much. We cut further ahead to Roger's circumnavigation of the world, as we see him with Rayleigh, Gaban, Crocus, Shanks, and Buggy, whose joining of the crew was not explained in any capacity unfortunately, despite sharing the same age as Shanks. As we re-witness Roger's execution, however, you may spot some familiar faces, as the man with the tattoo on his arm raising his hand in the air can be seen at the bottom left, who is named in a databook as being named Anjo, being a fan of pirates, and beyond him you can even spot the guy jumping in the air from excitement. Thanks to Harald's help, in part to pacify the union with giant kind, several giant recruits joined the Marines from different giant colonies around the world, perhaps including Samuanai, where Ida was from as well. If you notice, most of these giants match the giants with which we are familiar with that we saw during the Battle of Marineford. On the far right is the blonde giant woman, next to her is Vice Admiral Lacroix with his square jaw, then is the giant with the mohawk and the two big teeth, teeth, the one with the afro, what could be an unmasked Vice Admiral Lance, and the one giant Luffy beat with Gomu Gomu no rifle. Then it seems that 24 years ago, Harald was finally accepted in Marijoa, and with it he was given an offer to make a pact with Imu. In what seems like we are finally being told how Imu's pact with the devil works, so let's break it down. The three of these levels are all referred to as a keiyaku, which means a contract, but in this context can more specifically also refer to a deal or a pact. It sounds very clear that this is a deal with the devil. You could even call it a covenant. The three levels are: first, there is the Senkai Keiyaku, which translates to the shallow sea contract. Referring to shallow waters, this is the weakest of the contracts and only seems to be given to those with the rank of Kami no Jujin, which translates again to the servant blade of God. If you remember, this is the rank Gunko had at the time of God Valley, which was said to be a rank subservient to the God Knights, which seems to be more of an apprenticeship to those who are yet to become God Knights during a trial period, which had been the case for Gunko at the time of God Valley and now Harald. It seems that the mark on the arm serves as a mark of this pact, and in fact at this point really may be the mark or maku in Japanese that Killingham spoke of, seeing that only those with the mark can use the abyss. As such, it seems that those with the shallow sea contract may be able to make use of the abyss, but at wager they cannot make use of the immortality or further powers, particularly as it doesn't seem like Harald now was immortal, especially given he was, killed, and even someone like Shanks seemingly got his arm eaten and didn't regenerate it, which we'll get to later. Secondly, there is the Shinkai Keiyaku, which translates to the deep sea contract. Referring to the more profound sea, this contract seemingly applies to the Kami no Kishidan, or the Knights of God. It can be presumed that this contract grants access to the immortality, but not further powers conferred by Imu, which are only reserved for the highest rank. As we've seen, all the God Knights so far have possessed this immortality, allowing them to endlessly regenerate. God Knights can also telepathically communicate with Imu, which is an ability the Servant Blades seemingly don't have, as the Gorosei tell Harald that only if he becomes a knight shall he learn about Imu. As such, it is only from this point that one may be made aware fully of Imu's existence, though I wonder if other celestial dragons may have some vague idea given how the Flamingo knew about Imu, or if you found out some other way. I'm also curious if to the power of being able to possess the bodies of others is given to all God Knights, or if Gunko specifically was an exception in that regard, even if the former seems more likely at this point. It also seems, as we've seen with Gunko, that Imu may be able to brainwash anyone they can possess, so maybe Mu was counting to do that with Harald too. Finally, there is the Shinkai Keiyaku, which goofily translates to the deep sea contract, referring to the deepest of deepest areas of the sea. This contract seems to be the most complete package that grants access to all the devil's comfort abilities. Beyond use of abyss, the immortality, and the telepathy with Imu, those with the contract can seemingly also be granted perennial youth, allowing them to live forevermore as long as Imu is willing to let them. This explains why God Knights like Garling or Summers have aged over time while the Gorosei don't, though Gunko once again is an odd exception since she seems to be old enough to have known Brook as a child, who is 90 years old, but also hasn't aged since then, and even knew Imu over 50 years ago, again not aging, even before she was promoted to God Knight, so she definitely stands out as this weird exception. Beyond that, with this contract, at this point, Imu may or may not also confer a devil power to the individual, though we don't know if those are tied specifically to the contract or were something separate. As such, to recapitulate, the Servant Blades have access to the Shallow Sea contract, which gives them the mark and thus likely able to use the abyss, though still not fully clear. This included Gunko 38 years ago, Harald 24 years ago after some 13 years of working for the government, and Shanks 15 years ago. The God Knights have access to the Deep Sea contract, which includes 38 years ago Garling, Summers, Maffy, the blue-haired man mayor, the blonde woman, the guy with the skull mask, and the big bat-like guy, while at present it includes Gunko, Killingham, and Knight Commander Shamrock. Finally, the Deep Sea contract can be inferred to be only granted to the Gorosei, which includes the original 5, and now likely Garling, who has almost certainly been upgraded to that upper tier of contract. What's interesting is that a Gorosei explains that only 13 people have been granted access to the 2 highest tiers of contract, which means 5 Gorosei and 8 God Knights. I wonder if the number is fixed and has to always be the same, or if the number shifts and changes with time depending on recruits, but is generally kept tight. Or in other words, if a servant blade cannot rise to God Knight only if a previous God Knight dies of old age or is demoted for some other reason, like how Saturn was removed and replaced with Garling because the Gorosei are always 5, particularly when you consider they are immortal, so someone like Saturn could only be removed at Imu's behest. In the panel that Dragon was thinking of the God Knights, he visualized 9 of them with Shamrock at the center, but it's possible the numbers increased to 14 at present, though Oda could also just have slipped up and not thought about it as much. We also know that some people can be recruited to the God Knights, as not only did they try to do it here with Harald, but Loki got the offer later too, which now knowing about his father's past makes sense, as Imu blamed Harald for his mistakes, so perhaps they were trying to repeat things with Loki. And this also puts into question, given her past with Brook, if Gunko was always a man-mayor, or if she was adopted into the family one way or another. Interestingly, as we saw with Shanks and Shamrock too, it seems that only one father needs to be Celestial Dragon for the child to inherit the status, which also explains the Gorosei's concern at Uda's status as a member of the Fioreland family during film Red when we first heard that name, though it seems that they can definitely quickly demote them if they deem that necessary, as we saw with Bonnie as well. The naming convention of these contracts also makes a lot of sense once you consider that. I'm pretty sure we can all accept without any doubt now that Imu is the Sea Devil, the entity that was said to be responsible for the devil fruits as its incarnations according to legend. As such, Imu represents not just the devil but also the sea, the concept of water that paralyzes devil fruit users, and many other elements on a symbolical level, especially with the sinking of the world. Even Davy Jones was said to have been cursed by the devil to sink down to the deep sea floor. As such, the contracts being based on the depth of the sea makes perfect sense, showing how deep you sink into the sea itself. The following scene moves us to a new area of Marie-Joie, found within the Kamigami no Chi, or the Land of the Gods, which is the city of the celestial dragons, within what is called the Temple of Knights Shangala. The name, Shangara in Japanese, likely seems like a riff on Shangri-La, the fictional location of myth that is described as this heavenly temple located high in the skies, like an earthly paradise, which is fitting with the thematic of paradise in Marie-Joie, but instead modified to be Shangala instead of Shangri-La. The thing is though, this name may actually finally clue us into the etymology behind Shanks and Shamrock's names, as they both may have been named after this temple of Shangala, thus solving a 3-decade mystery, though almost certainly a retcon. The Garling wasn't present for the twins' birth, it's likely he may have told their mother ahead of time what names he wanted for a child when she was pregnant, which he may have taken from this temple. At the temple itself we see an older Garling, now with a beard and his later glasses, who here has the title of Dancho, or Knight Commander of the God Knights. Keep in mind that Knight Commander is a separate rank than that of Saiko Shirekan, or Supreme Commander of the God Knights. Currently in present day, Shamrock is the current Knight Commander, while Garling was further promoted to Supreme Commander. So I wonder at this time who was the Supreme Commander in Garling's place. Garling tells Harald to keep on a long distance then Mushi to be called, which makes me think once again Harald may have access to the Abyss to be summoned at any time. We cut to 20 years ago in the Ryugu Kingdom, where celebrations are underway at Ryugu Palace. Oda transitions cleverly by having the camera literally sink into the water and cause bubbles, as if we move from up above to down below. Neptune, who appears to be friends with just about every old legend like Roger and Whitebeard, relaxes with Harald, and the two talk about their children, with Neptune talking about the prophecy he heard from Shirley when he was with Roger. In the background we can also spot Otohime with Fukaboshi and a newborn Mamboshi with Zentap, which adds up since he's 20. Interestingly, Harald refers to the yet unborn Shirahoshi as your Mosa Mosa daughter, which is an expression that basically means your hairy daughter, in reference to how hairy Neptune is, that even his daughter will end up just as hairy. This isn't actually a new expression for Shirahoshi, as Roger made the exact same joke, calling his unborn daughter as your hairy daughter, just like Harald did. Though, as a slight distinction, Roger used Moza Moza and Harald used Mosa Mosa, but they fundamentally mean the same thing, just written differently, basically hairy or shaggy. Some Japanese fans also believe that Neptune's expression of Jamon could be Moza written in reverse, referring to his hairiness, though there's been contention to that since it's likely more derived from the ja used by older people and the common particle mon to finish sentences, or it could just be something Oda made up for different reasons. However, of course, what Oda is trying to spell here is pretty obvious. The Mosa Mosa daughter Neptune will have is almost almost certainly at this point, Mosako, the mysterious individual Loki has been speaking with through Denden Mushi. This may not be a shock to some, as several fans, particularly in the Japanese community, already push this theory very hard, mostly down to the fact of the Moja Moja comment that Roger already made, and the fact that Mosako's speech pattern was that of a delicate and frail woman, which largely fit that of Shirahoshi. This retroactively explains a lot of things. Loki and Shirahoshi have known each other for a while because their parents wanted them to meet each other for a potential future arranged marriage, though obviously that kind of fell through due to Harald's death and Loki leaving the country, although it seems the two remained friends, especially with how lonely both were, Shirahoshi stuck in the Shell Tower and Loki later imprisoned. We'll also have to later see how Loki eventually met Lola and fell for her, leading to that whole debacle with Big Mom, but going back to our duo, their recent dialogue makes sense, as it explains why Shirahoshi had a recent traumatic experience, which was likely her attempted kidnapping by Charlos at the Levely, with Loki even saying that he would be willing to kill all those there for her sake, and it once again reinforces why Loki called her a weakling just like Luffy did, but as such also puts so much worry as to what is happening to her right now that she had to call Loki and tell him that they may never be able to speak again, suggesting something terrible may be happening at Fishman Island. Has Kaido perhaps already tattled to Blackbeard and he's already moved to kidnap Shirahoshi? I can only worry more for her now. Switching to Elbaf still 20 years ago, we got an obligatory update on the point when Harald welcomes Sol after the Ohara incident, also putting in the request for the school to be built, just as we had been told several times. And in this scene you can spot Ripley next to Harald, and in fact you can even spot a little person atop the palm of her hand who is likely Kaban, who they just met and conceived Colin. We skipped ahead to 15 years ago during the great incident at the raid of Marijois. The public story goes that Fisher Tiger had climbed the Red Line and tried to break the slaves of Marijois out of kindness, leading a massive raid on the city. However, Tiger later confessed to his crew that he had in fact not raided Marijois by scaling the Red Line, but actually had been enslaved there for several years. However, he managed to break out, and it is at that point that he decided to try and free as many slaves as possible during his breakout to make sure he could save as many people as possible, or he would be too burdened with guilt by leaving others behind. However, there is more truth to that incident than it might seem. It's unclear if Tiger did indeed break out on his own, as several other celestial dragons complained about losing slaves or their cells being broken, with Tiger seemingly already trying to free other slaves. However, a lone figure appeared, very clearly being Shanks. Tiger manages to rip off a bandage off of his face, which causes a couple drops of blood to spill out as we can see, but Shanks instead strikes him on his collar, freeing Tiger, as the explosive collar would have stopped him otherwise. He also tells Tiger of the location of the armory, which gives Tiger the weapons to fight back, with which he was seen in depictions of the raid. We of course see the perspectives of Hancock as well as Koala, who were both freed thanks to this incident, and Oda even goes as far as to recreate the panel of the Boa sisters running away exactly as it looked in chapter 521. It's clear, however, that this was an inside job, but not at the knowledge of the government, rather at Shanks' own knowledge. 7 days after, as Harald visits the Holy Land, which is currently undergoing repairs, Garling introduces Shanks to Harald, who we are confirmed, indeed, was made a servant blade after returning to Marijois, where he quite seemingly pretended to get comfortable with his family again, all for the purpose of investigating the Holy Land, perhaps in a sense to scout enemy territory. To give you a gist of the timeline, this is long after Shanks found his crew, to the point that he already had all the familiar faces around him, and in fact, he even had already adopted a young Uta. So this was in fact a deep cover operation with a lot of meaning behind it, particularly as just the next year after this one is when Harald would be killed while Shanks was in Elbaf, and the year after that Shanks would steal the Gomu Gomu no Mi and meet Luffy for the first time, just 2 years after this point, though Luffy would only eat the fruit a year later. This also seems to motivate that the mark seen on his arm, just like we saw with Harald, is indeed the mark of the Abyss, particularly as Harald gets in this chapter when he also becomes a servant blade, which makes sense since, like we said, it looks like the logo of the God Knights. This does seem to support the idea that Shanks sacrificed his arm 3 years later for the sake of not just protecting Luffy, but also for the sake of getting rid of this mark, as perhaps having it on limited his abilities on working freely from Imu in some form. And since he wasn't a God Knight yet, he didn't possess the regeneration, which didn't allow him to regenerate the arm and thus be rid of it, past, finally explaining that riddle. Harald claims to recognize Shanks from somewhere before, perhaps through some meeting with Roger, though it's not one that has been brought up so far that I'm aware, although I wouldn't be surprised if Roger had visited Elbaf. However, Shanks plays fully into the role by being dismissive of Harald, so he walks away to walk through the streets with his brother, with several screams of idolation from other celestial dragons ringing throughout as indicated by the hearts. However, Harald glances back at the two and can tell that Shanks is hiding something. Indeed, if you remember, Shanks mentioned in chapter 1152 that he met Harald in Marijois and that there was something he couldn't talk about with him in the Holy Land, hoping he could do so now before it was too late, which in the end, it was. This clearly was that occasion, but I still wonder what it was and if it had to do with the legendary fruit. And of course, we have to acknowledge the Zunisha in the room, the bandage. Over time, we had been able to narrow down the time in which Shanks got the scar over his eyes, which was attributed to Blackbeard up to the point of it being from 19 to 14 years ago. But now we know that it was exactly 15 years ago before this moment. It's not clear if he got it just recently having joined as a servant blade, or if he was still as a pirate before rejoining with his family, but I wonder if it had any relation with his ascent to godhood. As we saw later with Tiger ripping off the bandage, we can also confirm that individual was Shanks, if it wasn't clear enough and anyone thinks it's Shamrock. If you compare Shanks to Shamrock, interestingly, Shanks' current outfit matches more his brother's current one, whereas Shamrock's outfit matches more his brother's current one. You can also notice the distinction how Shamrock is right-handed while Shanks is left-handed, until he lost his arm, which forced him to fight with his right hand instead. Moving back to Elbaf that same year, we find out that as we had feared, Ida had become ill. A doctor is trying to help out Ida, who you may actually recognize was one of the giant warrior pirates seen leading the attack on Egghead, maybe being the doctor of the crew. Ida asks Mato to take care of the tavern, which is why we saw her running the tavern more recently. Loki tries to help out in his own way, while instead Hyrudin is out at sea looking for a doctor, with help of Girth, Goldberg, Rode leading the way as the navigator, and Stanson too, though the latter definitely looks a lot younger than now, even if you can recognize his helmet. We get to properly see Brew Village, the hometown of Estrida, which fittingly has buildings shaped after barrels of grog. There the locals confess that they actually poisoned Ida out of paranoia that she's vying for the throne, but in retaliation, Loki massacres the villagers and burns the entire village down to the ground, because all this time, he truly saw Ida as his own and only real mother, even if he was never truly capable of telling her honestly. History told us that Loki burned the village to the ground as a prank, but the truth of history is always hidden when it is most convenient. Time and time again, this flashback has shown to us that accounts of Loki's life, as we've been told, have been said by people who never understood what he was truly going through, which does not justify some of his actions either, and does not mean he is a purely kind being, but it is clear that kindness within him has been nurtured by Ida, who truly loved him more than anyone else ever would, without ever expecting anything in exchange. And it is in that kindness within him that will allow Loki to finally find the resolution he has always desired.